Welcome to our Beer U module on strong ales. Strong ales are some of the heaviest hitters in the world of beer. They're high in alcohol and flavor. They're also a beer style that can be aged for decades and get better with time. We'd appreciate it if you could grab a strong ale and join us in tasting one while we explore them. Here's a list of them that you can refer to when making your choice, but please feel free to bring along your favorite strong ale on our journey, no matter which one it is. Strong ales are generally high alcohol beers ranging from 6% alcohol by volume at the low end to 12% and higher in some cases. They are rich in malt, which contributes to a very malty sweet beer that is sometimes accentuated by a large dose of hops. In some cases, a large dose of hops is needed to prevent the beer from being overly sweet or cloying. In other cases, brewers like to make them extremely hoppy in addition to being malty sweet. Strong ales are also known for being vinous or wine-like for several reasons. They are rich in flavor, and they are also closer in alcohol levels to wine than most other beers are, as they are so strong. And they are also quite capable of aging well and evolving in flavor over time. Because of the high alcohol levels and partly due to high hop additions, strong ales will usually age well for years or even decades. Some other styles of beer, when brewed to high alcohol levels, could be considered strong ales, but are usually left associated with the style that they are based on. In this presentation, we'll talk about the traditional strong ales that evolved as a style of beer on their own. Strong ales are not imperial stouts or imperial or double IPAs. Even though those beer styles are very high in alcohol, they are considered separately. Strong ales are malt-oriented beers that can be highly hopped, but which have a stronger malt backbone than imperial or double IPAs normally have. Strong ales also lack the extremely dark malts and roasted barley that imperial stouts contain. Not surprisingly, strong ales score fairly high in most of the measurable categories. They range from gold to brown in color, with some getting well into the dark brown colors. And starting at 6% alcohol by volume, they can range well into double digits in ABV. 12% is a common high-end strong ale, but there are examples of strong ales that go much higher than that. And while strong ales are known for their rich maltiness, a lot of hop bitterness is needed to help balance that richness, so they score high on the IBU scale as well. In some cases, they can be very hoppy beers as well as malty ones. Strong ales are one of the few types of beers that are normally brewed with first runnings alone. First runnings is the term that brewers give to the first water that is mixed with grain in the brewing process, specifically the part of the brewing process called the mash. First runnings are heavy with nutrients, starches, and sugars extracted from the grain. For other beers, a process called sparging sprinkles the grain with additional water after the first runnings have drained from the tank. The water from sparging is called second runnings and is lighter in nutrients, starches, and sugars than first runnings. With strong ales, the first runnings alone are used to make the beer, and second runnings are left for other beers or discarded entirely. Small beers are the beers brewed from only the second runnings of wort during or after the sparging process. They are not strong ales at all, despite this close relationship with them, as they often weigh in around 3 to 4% alcohol by volume, so there's really nothing strong about them. However, small beers are a long-standing tradition and have been brewed for hundreds of years. They were very common at times when safe drinking water was scarce and beer was consumed all day as a source of hydration and nourishment. For that purpose, low alcohol levels were desired. Brewing different beers from the same grain or mash results in a beer that is sometimes called a partaguile. A partaguile is a beer that was only one of multiple beers brewed from the same batch of grain. Prior to becoming the center of the pale ale universe, the brewing center at Burton was known for making a beer that is commonly called Burton Ale, which is the direct ancestor of today's strong ales. Burton ales were loosely defined and don't really constitute a beer style, but they were generally strong, dark, and sweet beers. They were lighter in color than porters and stouts, but darker than most English pale ales, which became very popular after Burton ales began to die out. At times they could be aggressively hopped, but they were extremely rich in malt, which made them both sweet and strong in alcohol. Burton ales started to disappear around the beginning of the 19th century, but their influence lives on today with strong ales. In the mid-19th century, searches for a northwest passage through the Arctic from Europe to the Pacific were underway. And just as other British naval expeditions were supplied with beer, so did the Arctic explorers take beer with them. In this case, Burton Ales were especially well suited to the task. They not only provided some of the comfort of home for men in extreme circumstances, but they were believed to have been a good source of nutrition, even attributed at times with the ability to stave off scurvy. Their high alcohol content also suited them well in cold temperatures, as they froze only at very low temperatures and rebounded to their regular consistency quite well if they did freeze and had to be thawed. In 1852, Queen Victoria commissioned Allsop's brewery of Burton to create Allsop's Arctic Ale to accompany explorers led by Sir Edward Belcher. Belcher was seeking the remains of another mission that had been lost 7 years earlier. He commanded 5 ships on his voyage, including HMS Resolute. A handful of original Arctic ale bottles survive to this day. The term barley wine is commonly used to describe strong ales. 2 of the 3 strong ale variants are known by this name, but the term is relatively new and does not appear with any frequency in beer literature until the 20th century. In 1854, large Burton brewer Bass released Bass No. 1. It was later called Bass No. 1 Barleywine by about 1870. Bass No. 1 was brewed almost continuously until 1995. It was brewed with more pale than dark malt, which made it lighter in color than many former Burton ales, and also more economical to produce than those brewed entirely with dark malts. With this beer, Bass set the standard for barley wines in England and began to popularize the phrase barley wine. The term barley wine emphasizes the high, almost wine-like alcohol levels of this type of beer. Strong ales eventually began to appeal to well-to-do drinkers used to consuming fine wines during the 19th century. These kinds of beers were well suited to the comparison to wine. Strong ales were expensive, mostly due to the high quantities of malt required to brew them, and the storage time required to age them also contributed to their relative high cost. Because of their cost, they held a natural appeal to wealthy drinkers who enjoyed owning the most expensive beers available. And throughout parts of the 19th century, England was at odds with France, a source for many wines. When this happened, wine shipments to England were impacted, and wine could become scarce due to the political conditions. Strong ales were offered as a replacement for wine at the dinner table. Strong ales are also referred to as being amongst the most vinous of beers. This is largely due to their complexity of flavor, coupled with their ability to age well. In many cases, aged strong ales can take on a very sherry-like flavor as they begin to oxidize. A word or two here about oxidation. Oxidation occurs when air gets into beer and interacts with it. Oxygen in the air can quickly start to produce new flavors in beer or wine, most of which are considered bad. An oxidized beer or wine might taste stale, old, or papery. Wet cardboard is a term commonly used to describe the flavor of oxidation in beer. Air and oxygen is almost bound to get into beer eventually, no matter how hard brewers try to keep it out. Caps, corks, and various bottling and kegging procedures are in place to keep oxygen away from beer, but eventually oxygen will seep into the smallest of cracks or the tightest of caps and corks. Then oxidation begins. But strong ales are actually brewed to be aged. Their high alcohol levels, hop additions, and complex malt character allows them to age much more gracefully than most beers. New flavors can emerge and bad flavors can be masked in strong ales. Over time, new flavors like sherry, toffee, or Madeira can emerge from the slow oxidation that occurs in strong ales. Many strong ales can age for a decade or longer and still taste wonderful. Prior to the year 1800, most beers were dark. That's because most of the malt used to make beer was dark in color due to the contamination and poor quality of malt drying that took place over open fires and in poor quality ovens. That changed with the advent of the coke oven, a device that grew with the Industrial Revolution. The coke oven made it possible to kiln malt under precise temperature control and without the contamination that an open fire contributed. By 1800, coke oven technology was widespread enough that it came to be used for malting. But pale malt wasn't important just for color. It was important to brewers because the efficiency of the malt in the brewing process was much greater than that of dark malt. This meant that brewers could brew beers with less pale malt than they had to use previously, making the beer cost less to produce. Strong ales were already expensive to produce because of the large amounts of malt they required. Lowering the cost of malt made it more attractive for brewers to continue making them. Stock ales were often referred to in England in centuries past and treated much like a specific style of beer, but stock ales aren't really a separate style at all. They're more of a slight variation of what we would call an old ale today. Stock ales were often high in both alcohol and hops, which made them perfect for long-term storage, which is fortunate because that's why they were brewed. Stock ales were meant to be stored for 6 months at a time or longer. Long storage in wooden barrels allowed stock ales to pick up flavors from the wood and develop additional flavors that would not have been present in a younger beer. Often the beer would acquire sour flavors from wild yeast present in the aging barrels. When served, stock ales were typically blended with other younger beers. Blending them with young beers masked serious defects while adding character and complexity to the younger beer. We've talked a bit about Burton Ales and stock ales, but those beers were loosely defined and are not considered to be specific beer styles according to the BJCP or Beer Judge Certification Program. The BJCP defines 3 different variants of strong ales. They are the Old Ale, the English Barley Wine, and the American Barley Wine. Old ales are a traditional English style. They are usually brewed with malt sugars that resist fermentation, leaving them sweet and with high but not extreme alcohol levels around 6 or 7% by volume. Old ales were normally aged in barrels for months or even years before being released. In the aging process, they mellowed and evolved. Often aged in wood barrels, they picked up flavors from the wood and sometimes soured due to the wild yeast living in the barrel. Modern versions of old ales are sometimes referred to as winter warmers and are brewed for the winter or holiday season. Sometimes a winter warmer is spiced or seasoned. English barley wines are the traditional strong ales of England. They were usually the strongest beer made by a brewer. 8% alcohol by volume or higher is common, although good versions of them do not taste strongly of alcohol. English barley wines are sometimes vintage dated for those who enjoy aging these beers or tasting the beer as it evolved over time. They are intensely and complexly flavored with malt characteristics like nutty, caramel, toffee, and molasses. They are sometimes very hoppy beers, with the English version making use of English hops. They are not normally as hoppy as their American barley wine counterparts, but they can feature more complex malt flavors than their American cousins. American barley wines are very similar to the English barley wine, with the most notable difference being the addition of large amounts of American hops. And while the English version lean towards malt flavors, the American versions usually lean towards hop bitterness layered on top of complex malt flavors. American hops usually impart flavors to the beer that are characteristic of those hop varieties. So on top of an already malty, complex beer, assertive American hop flavors like pine, resin, citrus, and floral are introduced with this beer style. When serving a strong ale, a snifter or similar glass is likely the best option. A snifter helps the beer to warm in your hands, allowing it to release more aroma and flavor character. Keep your pour relatively modest since the alcohol levels in these beers can be so high. These are sipping beers that don't need large pours. Because of their hardiness and complexity, they can be served very successfully as a digestif after dinner. Their sweetness and hop content suit them well for this role. And strong ales are some of the best possible choices to pair with sharp or blue cheeses. An English blue cheese like Stilton would be perfect with an English barley wine or old ale. Strong ales can work well with sweet desserts and chocolate. Try them with a dessert that isn't entirely chocolate and let the beer accent the chocolate notes within that dessert. And strong ales aren't always good choices for a main course, but they can pair nicely with roasted meats and poultry. Just be careful to pick a beer and meat that are relatively similar in intensities so as to not overwhelm one or the other.